a story of faith, courage, and purpose that has spanned generations. Discover the amazing journey of Esther, Queen of Persia, who became God's instrument for the salvation of her people. Hello! It's great to have you here. Today, I want to share a very special story, a journey of faith, courage, and purpose that has spanned generations and continues to inspire thousands of people around the world. This is the story of Esther, an ordinary woman who became a queen, and, more than that, became an instrument of God for the salvation of her people. If you enjoy inspiring stories and believe that you can learn something valuable from the journey of people who, with faith, overcame impossible challenges, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Your support is essential so that we can continue spreading messages of faith and inspiration to others. The journey that took me from an orphan to a queen is so extraordinary that I often find myself reflecting on every detail of this unexpected path. I clearly remember the day I was selected among so many other young Jewish women to embark on this unpredictable journey. Uncertainty hung over me, and the fear of the unknown mixed with a feeling of profound gratitude. Being chosen to stand before the king as a potential queen was something surreal, a story I would never have imagined starring in my simple and peaceful life with my people. Imagine with me a young orphan of humble origins, raised by a loving relative, living among her people, the Jews, in a foreign land. This was my life before I became Esther the Queen. In those days I had no idea what the future held for me, and I certainly never imagined that one day my life would cross borders and be told in so many places. I was born with the name Hadassah. This name carries within itself the essence of who I am, a simple girl who grew up in a home where faith and love for our God were our greatest heritage. Life began to teach me lessons from an early age. I lost my parents when I was very young, and as a child, I did not understand why. The absence of my parents was painful, and for a long time I felt that there was an emptiness inside me, a longing that seemed to never end. It was then that my cousin Mordecai came to find me. He welcomed me as a daughter, took care of me, and taught me the values that I carried throughout my life. Mordecai was a man of faith and wisdom, and he taught me to trust in God, even when life seemed meaningless. Mordecai used to tell me stories about our people, about God's promise to the children of Israel. He said that, even though we were in a foreign land, God would never abandon us, and that He had a purpose for each of us. I was very young, and although His words brought comfort to my heart, I could not fully understand what they meant. How could an orphaned girl with no great prospects for the future imagine that God had a plan for her life? I grew up hearing these stories, and little by little, they shaped my worldview. I learned from Mordecai that although we were living in a place where we were seen as foreigners, we had a spiritual heritage that reminded us of who we really were. Until one day, something changed. A piece of news spread throughout the city, creating a buzz that took hold of the people. King Xerxes, the ruler of Persia, had decided to look for a new queen. Xerxes was no ordinary king. He ruled one of the greatest empires in history, a kingdom that stretched across vast lands from the banks of the Indus River to Egypt. With almost unlimited power and an unbeatable army, he was feared and respected by all. Xerxes had an imposing presence, the charisma and strength of a man accustomed to winning, to commanding, and to seeing his orders carried out without hesitation. His posture was that of a true emperor, and his gaze had a mixture of authority and serenity that inspired both loyalty and fear. His kingdom reflected this greatness. Persia was an empire of vast wealth, with an opulent court and palaces adorned with columns of marble, gold, and precious stones. The lands under his rule contained a diversity of cultures, peoples, and languages, all subject to Xerxes' will. The palace where he resided was a symbol of all this majesty, built to be the center of Persian power, radiating authority in all directions of the empire. Here, every detail, from the mosaics on the floors to the tapestries on the walls, celebrated the supremacy of a kingdom built on conquest and alliances. Xerxes commanded the most powerful army in the known world. His army was a fearsome force, composed of disciplined soldiers, skilled archers, and formidable horsemen. These men were not just warriors, they were fighting machines trained for victory, capable of marching through deserts and mountains, and of facing enemies with lethal precision. His military contingent was an impressive sight: gleaming shields, sharp spears and armor that reflected the desert sun, creating an image of invincibility that, in itself, was capable of demoralizing any opponent. Persian power was further enhanced by a naval fleet that patrolled the waters of the Mediterranean, protecting trade routes and ensuring that Xerxes' name was respected in every port. Under his rule, the empire had reached an unprecedented extent, with nations and territories annexed to his domain, each contributing tribute that further enriched Persia. The previous queen, Vashti, had disobeyed the king during a grand 7-day feast. In an unexpected act, she refused to appear before him and his guests, an unacceptable affront for someone with Xerxes' status and power. The royal council soon suggested that Vashti's disobedience might inspire other women to challenge the authority of their husbands and their kings. So Vashti was deposed from the throne, and the search began for a new Queen, who could not only sit on the throne at Xerxes' side, but who also had the elegance and submissiveness that the kingdom expected of a royal consort. The news seemed surreal, like a distant tale of kingdoms and palaces that I never thought would touch my life. After all, I was just a young Jewish girl, living a quiet life among my people, devoted to simplicity and the teachings that Mordecai had lovingly taught me. What chance did I, Hadassah, have of being called to the palace of the most powerful king of the time? But the royal decrees made no distinctions between origin, wealth, or culture. When the king's call was made, orders were sent to all the provinces, sending soldiers to each village to search for young women who might please the sovereign. It was then that, among many others, my name was chosen. The order was clear: all young women were to be taken to the palace. Fate did not ask me if I was ready, whether or not I desired that path. There I was, leaving my home, saying goodbye to Mordecai and my simple life, entering an unknown and fearful journey. The palace, with its opulence and strange customs, was a place I did not understand, and the people around me seemed to speak a language of gestures and postures that were not natural to me. I was a foreigner in a pompous and distant court, where a person's worth was measured by titles and wealth. I had not been brought here by my own choice, but by the decree of a king I barely knew, and who had the power to shape the destinies of thousands, including my own. I was just Hadassah, a young Jewish girl among many others. At that moment, all I had was my faith. On the way to the palace, my heart was filled with conflicting feelings. The fear and uncertainty were almost unbearable. I wondered why this was happening to me. Did God have a greater purpose, even if I did not understand it? Was I being led by a divine plan? These questions echoed in my mind, but there were no answers. All I knew was that I had to remain true to who I was, true to Mordecai's teachings, and most importantly, true to God. When I arrived at the palace, I found myself in a completely different world. The opulence, the luxury, the protocols, it was all new and in a way frightening. I was among so many other young women, each of whom dreamed of being chosen by the king. But deep down I had no ambition for wealth or power. My true identity was my most precious secret, and Mordecai had instructed me to hide it. "No one must know that you are Jewish, Esther," he told me. Yes, from that moment on, I began to be called Esther. The name Hadassah was left behind, but her essence remained in my heart. At first, it was hard to understand why Mordecai insisted so much that I hide my identity, but I trusted him. I knew he was a wise man and that he was only protecting me. So I followed his instructions and lived in the palace, taking on a new name and a new role, but always with the certainty that God was with me. Each day I prayed silently, asking for strength and wisdom to face this challenge. As time went by, I began to stand out among the other young women. Although I did not seek the king's favor, he began to notice me in a special way. I was different from the other young women, and perhaps that caught his attention. Until one day, to my surprise, he chose me to be his queen. I, Hadassah, the Jewish orphan, was now queen of Persia. It was like living in a dream, but at the same time, the weight of that position fell upon me. I knew I had a responsibility, but I did not know exactly what it would be. As queen, I had access to the king and the affairs of the kingdom, but there was still a distance. My position was delicate. I could not forget where I came from, and most importantly, what Mordecai had taught me about being faithful to our God. My life was marked by constant tension on the one hand. I had to fulfill my role as queen on the other. There was the secret I was keeping that could ruin everything. All of this escalated when a powerful and influential figure entered the scene: Haman. He was the king's advisor, and it quickly became clear that he was not a man of pure heart. Ambitious and cruel, Haman had no regard for the good of the people. His lust for power and arrogance quickly became apparent, and that's when the conflicts began. Haman demanded absolute respect, expecting everyone to bow down to him. But Mordecai, my cousin and mentor, refused to bow down. He was faithful to God and believed that only God was due such reverence. Mordecai's stance infuriated Haman, and from that moment on, he harbored a deep hatred for my cousin and, by extension, for all of our people. His wounded pride led him to a dark plan, one that would destroy every Jew in the kingdom. The arrogance of Haman was something I could feel even from a distance. With each passing day, he became more intolerant, more obsessed with his own authority. Mordecai, with his unwavering faith and firmness, became the main target of his wrath. Haman could not bear the idea of someone daring to defy him, someone who refused to bow before him. My heart tightened every time I heard about the humiliations he tried to impose on Mordecai, but my cousin remained steadfast, refusing to betray his faith. This only made Haman hate him even more. Haman's initial contempt for Mordecai grew like a flame fueled by his vanity. It was not enough to humiliate him. He wanted more. He wanted to erase Mordecai and, along with him, our entire people. He was not content with mere obedience. He sought to extinguish our presence in the kingdom. With his position of power, Haman began to devise an evil plan. He knew how to manipulate words and, using his influence in the palace, managed to sow distrust in the heart of King Xerxes. I remember the murmurs in the hallways, the counselors whispering about a strange people who, according to Haman, threatened the peace of the king. He used his cunning to convince Xerxes that we, the Jews, were insubordinate and treacherous, that our laws and customs posed a danger to the unity of the empire. It was as if our lives were reduced to lies crafted to feed his thirst for destruction. With his manipulative skill, Haman proposed a terrible solution to extinguish all the Jews in the kingdom. And to strengthen his plan, he offered the king an absurd sum of silver, suggesting that the royal treasury would profit from this decision. King Xerxes, perhaps not fully grasping the magnitude of such an act, trusted Haman and authorized the decree, sealing it with his royal ring. When I heard about it, a chill ran down my spine. I knew that Haman had turned his personal vendetta into a cruel attack against my people. When the decree was announced, the impact was devastating. My people, spread across the provinces of the kingdom, were gripped by panic. Families gathered in secret, trying to understand how they would survive such a mortal blow. Mordecai, upon hearing of the decree, tore his clothes in mourning. He covered himself in ashes and went to the palace gates, openly weeping for the tragedy that was about to unfold. He knew this was not just a personal threat against him, it was a sentence against an entire nation. Meanwhile, Haman reveled in his so-called victory. I remember hearing reports about his triumphant expression, how he walked through the court with an air of satisfaction. He believed he had won, that his revenge would be complete. But Haman, in his arrogance, made a grave mistake. He underestimated the strength of faith and the courage that God was cultivating within me. At that moment, something awakened in my heart. I knew I could not remain silent. God had placed me in this palace for a purpose, and even without fully understanding how, I knew I would have to face him. Haman had unleashed a storm, but he had no idea that the Lord, the God of Israel, was already preparing the path for our victory. I was the queen, but how could I save my people without risking my own life? And worst of all, how could I reveal to the king that I was Jewish? Faced with this threat, my heart filled with fear, but also with a courage I didn't know I had. It was at that moment, with the decree of destruction already signed, that Mordecai sent me a message that would change everything. He reminded me that, even though I was in the palace, I was still one of us, a Jew. He told me that perhaps the reason I had been placed in that position, at that very moment in history, was precisely to intercede for our people. Mordecai, words echoed in my mind. Who knows if it was not for such a time as this that you came to the throne? Those words confronted me. He was calling me to act, to use my position for something much greater than myself. But the reality was that to approach the king without being called upon would be to put my life at risk. At that time, no one could present themselves to the king without being summoned, and that included even the queen. The punishment for such an act could be death. I found myself torn between fear and responsibility. Could I risk my life for the good of my people? What if the king did not accept my presence? What if he simply rejected me? These doubts invaded my mind, but at the same time there was something stronger that drove me faith. I remembered everything Mordecai had taught me since I was little, and it was then that I made a decision. Calling all my people to fast and pray for me, I asked Mordecai to convey this message. For 3 days, none of us would eat or drink anything. I would also fast and pray, seeking strength from God, because I knew that without him none of this would be possible. It was a period of deep silence, of introspection, of total surrender. Each moment of fasting was an opportunity to surrender my doubts and fears to God, to ask him to guide me and give me wisdom for what was to come. On the 3rd day, I donned my royal robes, said a silent prayer, and walked toward the king's throne. My heart was racing, and each step felt like an eternity. I knew that by crossing that threshold, I would be placing my life in the hands of the king, but most of all, in the hands of God. The courage I felt at that moment was not my own. It was a strength that could only come from the Lord. It was the certainty that if I were to perish, I would perish for a greater purpose. As I entered the throne room, the silence was almost deafening. All eyes were on me. The king, upon seeing me, raised his scepter toward me, signaling that I had permission to approach. The peace I felt at that moment was indescribable, a confirmation that God was with me. I approached the king and, in a voice that tried not to waver, asked him to come to a banquet that I would prepare for him and Haman. He accepted the invitation, and in that moment I knew that the Lord was guiding my steps. At the first banquet, I prepared everything with great care, and my intention was clear: to create an environment of trust. I knew that I could not reveal my request right away. I had to wait for the right moment. So I invited the king and Haman to a second banquet. During that time, I continued to pray silently, asking God to give me the wisdom I needed to act at the right time. Finally, at the second banquet, I felt that the Lord had given me the courage and the words I needed. The king, curious, asked me what I really wanted, and then, with all the strength I could muster, I made my request. I asked that he spare my life and the lives of my people. The king, confused, asked who would dare threaten the lives of the queen and her people. And at that moment, looking directly at Haman, I revealed the enemy is this man. Haman was paralyzed, and the king, overcome with anger, ordered his punishment. The man who had plotted against the Jews, who had tried to exterminate my people, met the end he himself had planned. Peace and relief filled my heart, but there was something deeper: and immense gratitude for having been used by God to save my people. I knew that I could never have done it alone. Every step, every decision had been guided by the hand of the Lord, who had worked his will through my life. That decree was revoked, and the Jewish people were saved. The news spread quickly, and joy filled every heart. Our victory was not just a victory over the enemy, but a victory of faith over fear, of courage over uncertainty. God had been faithful, and he had shown us that when we place ourselves in his hands, he is capable of doing the impossible. And so it was that, from that day on, the Jewish people began to celebrate Purim, a day to remember our salvation and God's faithfulness. I vividly remember the celebratory atmosphere that surrounded the celebration of Purim in our village. Every street was decorated with colorful lanterns, bright fabrics, and fragrant flowers, creating a magical and festive scene that heralded the arrival of the holiday. The tantalizing aromas of freshly baked bread and traditional delicacies wafted through the air, stimulating the senses and awakening nostalgia for times gone by. Children ran through the alleys, their eyes shining with anticipation of the games and sweets that would mark the special day. Amidst the songs sung in unison, the fraternal hugs exchanged, and the emotional tears shed, I felt a deep connection with my roots, with my community, and with the greater purpose that united us in that unique moment of joy and praise. May the memory of Purim remain alive in our hearts forever, reminding us of the transformative power of hope, determination, and unwavering faith. Over the years, this story has been told from generation to generation, not only as a reminder of the salvation of the Jewish people, but as a powerful lesson in faith and purpose. Every time I think about how I was placed on that throne, how God used every detail of my life to fulfill such a grand plan, I realize that nothing is by chance. No situation, no matter how simple or complex it may seem, is beyond God's control. Ever since I was a little girl, Hadassah, he had already planted seeds of faith in my heart. When I lost my parents, he placed Mordecai in my life as a guide and protector. With each experience, with each step, God was preparing my spirit to face a mission that I could never accomplish alone. What seemed like a difficult and painful sequence of events was, In fact, a journey of strengthening, a training for what was to come. What if I had given up? If I had ignored Mordecai's call? If I had kept quiet and let fear dominate my heart? Maybe, today, my story would not exist. Maybe my people would have been exterminated. That's why I want you to remember something very important. You have a purpose. You may not be on a throne, you may not see yourself as someone important, but know that God knows your worth. He knows who you really are, even if you haven't discovered it yourself yet. So if you ever feel alone or helpless, remember this story. Remember that God uses those who are willing to trust Him, no matter the situation. Sometimes, all we need to do is take a step of faith, even when we don't see the path ahead. Maybe you're in a moment like that right now. Maybe there's something in your heart that you know you need to do, but fear is holding you back. I understand. I've been there. But believe me, when we trust and take that step, God transforms our faith into courage. He guides us, strengthens us, and carries us forward, even when everything seems uncertain. And when we look back, we'll see that every challenge we faced was part of a much greater purpose. I hope this message inspires you to never give up, to always believe that God is with you. And of course, if you feel that this story brought something positive to your life, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to keep receiving new stories. Enjoy and leave in the comments, which biblical hero would you like to see the journey told here? That way, you will be helping this message reach more people who need a word of faith and inspiration. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this story strengthened your faith. Remember, God is the one who sustains us and prepares us for great missions. Until next time.